There is quite a bit to cover here with some really interesting data around consumer sentiment, retail sales, and again, we'll also touch briefly on some of the Fed member commentary after this very high inflation print there last afternoon. I hope you're enjoying the sunshine. We have a bit of a shorter session here this week, but a lot to cover with consumer sentiment, retail sales numbers, and of course, the Fed commentary, Fed member commentary after the very high inflation print there last week. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, the data, the trends that we're watching, and hopefully weed out some of the noise along the way. And again, this week we will go a little bit shorter as we do have a client event coming up this evening where we're going to be talking about market updates and some tax planning considerations with some changes ahead. And so we're going to skip the question of the week, but we do not want to shortchange today's session because there is quite a bit to cover here with some really interesting data around consumer sentiment, retail sales, and again, we'll also touch briefly on some of the Fed member commentary after this very high inflation print there last week. So let's start with the two maybe easier points, which are consumer sentiment and retail sales. So last week on Friday, we had consumer sentiment data come out. Basically, it was down a bit from last month and slightly below expectations. Nothing significant necessarily, but nonetheless, maybe a suggestion that the consumer is not feeling quite as optimistic as they might have been the prior month, or certainly some of the months heading into 2024 here. However, although the consumer sentiment was down, what we saw very quickly into this week was we had retail sales numbers come out. And so although the consumer maybe is not feeling as confident or as optimistic, the retail sales numbers would certainly suggest otherwise. They were extremely strong. And, we obviously have quite a few challenges that are starting to kind of percolate. And even so, despite all of this out there, despite, consumer sentiment coming down, retail sales were actually up 0.7%, which was much higher than expected. And really on the back of a, really high number for last month as well, where retail sales were up 0.9%. So the general message here, the theme is that the consumer just keeps spending. I mean, it's kind of regardless of what's going on, whatever challenges we might hear, how they're feeling, it would seem that we are all still spending. And certainly maybe that's what's kind of continuing to keep things afloat, so to speak, in this world. But nonetheless, consumer is showing strength as far as the spending goes. The question, of course, is how long does that last? What does that mean in terms of future, as potentially inflation continues to take a bite out of all of our kind of earnings capacity, right? But with that, we'll shift a little bit and focus a bit on Fed speak this week. And although a lot of the Fed members had shared some opinions, some thoughts, what I really want to focus on is Fed Chair Powell, of course, and just kind of his take on the higher inflation there last week. And basically what he had shared is if I can put this into 4 words, it was a lack of further progress. And I think that that's really where we want to focus on. And really what he was referring to, as you might imagine, is talking about inflation this year. Obviously, when Fed Chair Powell came out and said this on Tuesday, the markets didn't like this very much, certainly weren't very appreciative of his comments. And, it certainly is suggesting a very unlikely scenario now of any rate cuts in the June meeting. Now, to be clear, we still have one more Fed meeting and decision coming up on May 1st prior to the June meeting. But nonetheless, coming into the year, really the idea was that we were going to have cuts starting in June and, potentially see 3 or more. That's looking less and less likely, obviously, as the year kind of carries out. And these comments would certainly suggest that as well. Again, lack of further progress when talking about inflation this year. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight this is because I'm glad that he's recognizing that the Fed is recognizing that, because if we go back to last meeting, there was a lot of conversation about how much progress has been made as far as inflation this year. So I guess, it's funny to see the change in tone, but I think that that is a better scenario than a Fed that kind of, digs its heels in, sticks to its guns, and pretends like inflation is, like it's not an issue. So, for what it's worth, I think that is a better scenario than the alternative. But certainly the Fed Chair Powell and Fed members are definitely taking this inflation thing a bit more seriously after the last 2 months of higher inflation numbers. And, again, it looks very unlikely that we would see a June rate cut at this point. even if the next 2 months, so that leaves April and May as far as inflation data before that June meeting, even if those numbers show a decrease, I think that it would have to be significant for the Fed to make any changes in that June meeting. And primarily because, here they are sharing that there is a lack of further progress, and they've shared time and time again, they need to see consistency that inflation is coming down. This would suggest we certainly won't have that, even regardless of what the April and May inflation numbers suggest. So just wanted to kind of highlight that as we gear up for the May 1st meeting, but more importantly, looking at that June meeting ahead. Again, we are going to skip our question of the week this week here because we do have a client event this evening. But stay tuned next week. We'll cover GDP figures and we'll get a bit further into earnings season as well. So we'll share a bit more about what we're watching there. But definitely let us know if you have any questions. We'll come back to that next week and would be more than happy to help answer anything on your mind. In the meantime, enjoy the sunny weekend and we will see you next Thursday at 3.